There is a name on the manifest that was never crossed off because it was never written down. J.P. Morgan owned the ship. He booked the suite. Then, days before departure, he withdrew. Illness, his office said. Photographs taken in France shortly after showed a man in excellent health, rested and unhurried. 3 other men were not so fortunate: Jacob Astor IV, Benjamin Guggenheim, and Isidor Straus. The 3 wealthiest independent financiers in America all boarded. None survived. 18 months later, on a near-empty Christmas Eve, Congress passed the Federal Reserve Act. The field, by then, was clear. There's a version of the Gilded Age that textbooks render in soft focus: excess and inequality, as though the era's only sin was having too much. What that framing erases is the specific character of that wealth. It was independent. It answered to no central authority, no federal lending mechanism, and no coordinating institution. The men who held it could say no. That capacity, the structural ability of private American capital to refuse, is what made certain men dangerous by 1910. Jacob Astor IV was the wealthiest individual in the United States, with a fortune exceeding $2 billion in contemporary terms. At 47, he was at the center of American resources and reputation. He boarded at Cherbourg in Suite C62. Benjamin Guggenheim represented a different architecture of power, with a family fortune rooted in the very metals, silver, copper, and lead, that fueled industrial expansion. Isidor Straus, co-owner of Macy's and a former member of the House of Representatives, possessed the kind of standing that made his opposition consequential. 3 men, 3 distinct fortunes, and 3 irreplaceable networks of independent capital were all aboard the same vessel. These 3 men shared a structural position in American finance that placed them in direct conflict with a plan drafted at a private meeting on Jekyll Island in November 1910. This was not a public session. It was a retreat attended by Senator Nelson Aldrich, representatives of the Rockefeller interests, and agents of the Morgan and Kuhn Loeb financial houses. They traveled under false names to architect a privately controlled American central bank. This framework required the absence of organized, well-funded opposition. Astor, Guggenheim, and Straus had the means to fund lawyers, retain senators, and sustain a legislative fight. After April 12, they could do nothing. J.P. Morgan understood this landscape. His International Mercantile Marine Trust had acquired the White Star Line in 1902. The Titanic was, in the most literal corporate sense, his ship. He had reserved a private promenade suite, and several of his associates booked passage. Then came the cancellations, one by one, citing illness. Morgan's office cited health concerns, yet he was photographed in France that same week, looking rested. The ship he owned departed Southampton on April 10, 1912, carrying his 3 most significant financial opponents. It did not carry him. During the subsequent Senate inquiry, 82 witnesses were called, but J.P. Morgan was not among them. The inquiry accepted his excuse of poor health without issuing a subpoena or requesting his correspondence with White Star Line management. The record reflects a space where answers should be, much like the physical anomalies surrounding the ship itself. The Olympic and Titanic were built side by side, nearly identical. In 1911, the Olympic collided with a British warship, and the insurance claim was denied. The White Star Line had a massive liability in the Olympic, while the Titanic was fully insured and worth more on paper if destroyed than if operational. This switch theory remains a point of intense research, citing hull number markings and propeller specifications that some argue were inconsistent with the Titanic's documented configuration. Violet Jessup, a crew member who survived both the Olympic collision and the Titanic sinking, wrote of a persistent sense that the ships were not what the official record described. While these are not verified facts, they are observations that have never been conclusively answered. What is verified requires no speculation. The Titanic maintained 22 knots in waters where ice warnings had been received and acknowledged. The binoculars for the lookouts were locked away. The key had been taken by a crew member who departed at Southampton. The men were watching for ice with naked eyes in the dark at high speed. 12 miles away, the Californian sat stopped, its captain having halted due to ice. The Californian's crew observed rockets, the universal signal for distress, rising from a ship in the distance. They reported this to Captain Stanley Lord, but he did not order his ship to move. The rockets were seen, noted, and left unanswered. The official inquiries produced a verdict of accident, ice, speed, and insufficient lifeboats. While these findings were accurate, they are capable of coexisting with a prior decision to let the accident occur. By the time the inquiries closed, Astor, Guggenheim, and Straus had been dead for months. Their estates were passing to heirs, and their networks were dispersing. Their ability to fund a prolonged legislative resistance to the Jekyll Island framework had gone with them into the North Atlantic. Through the remainder of 1912 and into 1913, the framework moved steadily through the legislative process. By December 23, 1913, the House and Senate passed the Federal Reserve Act. President Wilson signed it that evening. The session was diminished. Most members had already departed for Christmas recess. The men most likely to object with sustained institutional weight were not in the room. They were not absent by accident. They were absent by sequence. The documented record requires no embellishment, only the list. November 1910, the Jekyll Island framework is drafted in secret. April 1912, the three wealthiest opponents of concentrated financial power board a ship owned by the man coordinating that framework. The ship sinks, the owner does not board. December 1913, the framework becomes law during a quiet Christmas session. March 1914, the Federal Reserve banks open. The Federal Reserve Act did more than create a bank. It transferred the authority to issue American currency away from the Treasury and placed it into a network of privately owned regional banks. The ownership of those banks was held by the same class of financial institutions that had drafted the proposal in secret 3 years earlier. The opposition that might have funded a resistance was gone. While there are no surviving documents of Astor, Guggenheim, or Straus articulating specific opposition to the Jekyll Island plan, their lack of a manifesto is not evidence of indifference. Men in their position did not commit sensitive political stances to letters that might circulate. What they possessed was capacity. Independent capital does not require a manifesto. It requires only the decision to deploy. After April 12, that deployment was impossible. The decision could not be made by men at the bottom of the North Atlantic.